Tim Bitts here this morning, joining me, and we're going to talk about a response I received to The Wideness of the Sea, my book on how to be evangelical and gay affirming. Specifically, I want to talk about a response I received from a radio host who declined to do an interview. And this is interesting because this is somebody I know in Christian radio. So I reached out to them and said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing a interview on this book?" And this was their response. "Oh boy, I'd be excited to read this on a personal level, but my boss would kill me if I went there on the air. Honestly, I wish I could, but I can't." And I responded, I said, "Well, thanks, for letting me know, and I'm not surprised because as I noted to this person, the book actually begins with a discussion of psychological safety. The idea that a person has the freedom to be able to express potentially controversial or divergent or unorthodox opinions in a group. And psychological safety is the sign of a healthy community. Evangelical Christian communities are, in my experience of 50 years, are almost always not psychologically safe communities, because there are all sorts of verboten or forbidden topics that you cannot discuss, whether it's raising questions and doubts about your Christian faith, or whether God exists, or whether God rose from the dead. In fact, let me talk about that one for a moment. I've talked about this, I know, before on my YouTube channel. I had a former student when I was a professor who was very high up in, well, not that high up, but he had been in a well-known Christian ministry for 20 years and had excelled at that ministry. And one day he expressed doubts about the resurrection of Jesus, which he'd also shared with me. He shared doubts about that with a colleague. The next day, he was called into the office of the director, who said, "I hear that you're having doubts that Jesus rose from the dead. You are fired." And they gave him no severance. He actually had to file a lawsuit in order to get the severance that he was owed. But they just turfed him because he privately expressed doubts that he would never share publicly. I can't imagine a clearer example of a community lacking psychological safety than that. And so it is with the question of same-sex relationships, right? This is not a safe conversation to have, the possibility of being inclusive on this. The other thing I just wanted to talk about before I draw this all to a close is, well, obviously this is a problem. And if a community is really a truth-seeking community, as evangelical communities purport to be, they will not be threatened by questions, serious explorations of issues, doubts, having and sponsoring open debate because they think they have the truth. And if you think you have the truth, you shouldn't be threatened by people wanting to open a conversation about it and consider counter arguments. So it says to me, if you are afraid to allow a conversation to happen, that is because deep inside there's probably some kind of insecurity that you're dealing with. And maybe you're not as secure in the truth as you've led yourself to think. Now, the last thing I just want to point out is this, and this comes out of my experience of having been a seminary professor for 20 years. Very often within evangelical communities, there is this thought that the second you want to have a conversation or a debate about something or admit questions or doubts or concerns, you have now become an advocate for a contrary position. So simply saying, "Hey, I think we need to consider the debate on both sides for same-sex relationships and whether an inclusive stance could be consistent with evangelical Christian opinion." The second that you say, "I think we should have a debate about it," you are now an advocate for that position. The second you say, "Hey, maybe evolution is not inconsistent with the doctrine of creation," you are now an advocate for evolution. And of course, in many of these cases, you are in fact an advocate for affirmation of gay marriage or for evolution. But it doesn't follow, or I would just want to say we need still to distinguish between being an advocate for X and being an advocate for a conversation or a debate or an open discussion about X. And ultimately, for me, in this question of same sex relationships and all of these other theological debates that are often considered hot potatoes, verboten, forbidden issues of discussion, like what you think about evolution or politics or abortion or some other issue that evangelicals have defined themselves on, to have open debates about these issues is not necessarily mean that's your position is for advocacy of the position, but rather you're advocating for the debate and thus for the psychological safety of your community. You're saying, look, we need to have evangelical Christian communities that are not afraid to have serious debates and discussions. And that is really at my heartbeat, because I think, for the most part, live up to the claim that I want to pursue truth. And because I want to pursue truth rather than ideology, I'm not afraid to have open questions, debates, to take a devil's advocate stance sometimes. That's something I've done in public debates. I've argued for the contrary. I've argued for atheism, for example, when debating Michael Roos, because I'm not afraid to explore, and I've done several devil's advocate debates. I'm not afraid to explore and defend the contrary view, because if that view is true, I want to know about it. And one of the best ways to know and evaluate the evidential strength for a position is to commit to defending it even when you don't hold to it. So if you are pursuing truth and you're in a psychologically safe community, you should not be afraid of any question or any debate. And that's why I found this response from my friend who's in Christian radio to be not at all surprising, but just to reinforce the experiences I've sadly seen in evangelical communities over the last 50 years. If you are interested in open discussion, if you want to pursue truth, whatever the cost, if you have an open mind to consider views contrary to yours, and if you think the evangelical church should be open to having a serious discussion about gay marriage and considering the theological arguments for and against it, then pick up your own copy of The Wideness of the Sea.